Alice Walker is an American writer and activist. She campaigns tirelessly for women's rights and for civil rights, and wherever people are oppressed in the world, then that's where you'll often find this writer. Her most famous novel is one called The Colour Purple, and that was published in 1982, and it caused a real stir at the time. It tells the story of Celie, a black, barely literate girl who is regularly beaten and raped by her brutal, domineering father. It's a harrowing but ultimately uplifting novel because Celie does eventually overcome her oppression through the strength she finds in other women. So it's a novel about sisterhood, really. I mentioned The Colour Purple because it was written the year before Poem at 39, and I think when we come to looking at the poem, this could be important. Alice Walker was saying some extremely challenging things in The Colour Purple about black men in the community that she grew up in and about their treatment of women. And that's a point that we'll return to when we look at the poem in some detail. That's not to suggest, though, that Poem at 39 is a political poem particularly. It isn't. It's very personal, in fact. It's about grief, loss. It's about Alice Walker remembering her father and missing him, essentially. So it's intensely personal. How I miss my father. I wish he had not been so tired when I was born. Writing deposit slips and cheques, I think of him. He taught me how. This is the form, he must have said, the way it is done. I learned to see bits of paper as a way to escape the life he knew, and even in high school had a savings account. He taught me that telling the truth did not always mean a beating, though many of my truths must have grieved him before the end. How I miss my father. He cooked like a person dancing in a yoga meditation and craved the voluptuous sharing of good food. Now I look and cook just like him. My brain light, tossing this and that into the pot, seasoning none of my life the same way twice, happy to feed whoever strays my way. He would have grown to admire the woman I've become, cooking, writing, chopping wood, staring into the fire. These are the opening lines of the poem, and you can see at a glance that it's written in free verse. There's no rhyme, there's no regular rhythm either. The lines are all different lengths. Last one in the stanza, just one word long. Walker's chosen free verse because she wants this poem to sound like her train of thought, not something carefully crafted or structured, but her honest feelings about her father as they occurred to her, almost. The free verse also enables her to use enjambment very heavily through the poem, and through this device she's able to emphasise key ideas. So if you look at the last three lines in this opening stanza, so tired when I was born, you would expect that to be one line, wouldn't you? But by breaking it up in that way, she kind of reflects the fact that she's thinking out loud almost in this poem, thoughts not coming to her necessarily smoothly. She's perhaps struggling to capture the words to convey her feelings about her father. So that's one reason for the broken line. But another reason is that she's able to emphasise key ideas. So the fact that so tired is on its own line emphasises the tiredness of her father, and clearly the idea of being born, a big one, a line on its own. So enjambment enables her to emphasise key ideas as well as to convey a sense of her struggling with ideas, struggling to convey exactly what she's thinking and feeling. So the poem's not a smooth, structured, polished thing. It's broken, and these are difficult thoughts, perhaps, that she's sharing with us. The poem begins with the line, "How I miss my father," and that immediately sets a tone of regret and loss. Alice Walker is regretting the fact that her father is gone, and clearly she misses him. The tone does shift though, because in the first couple of stanzas there is a strong sense of regret that he was always so tired, he had to work so hard, and life was difficult. But then after the second, "Oh, how I miss my father," which is an exclamation the second time it's used, the tone becomes more positive, and Alice Walker understands that she has in fact been inspired by her father. There are things about them that are very similar, and she thinks that he'd be proud of her were he alive. That's a bittersweet thought, really. On the one hand, she's comforted by the fact that she's like her father. They had more in common, perhaps, than she ever realised, and in a sense he's living on through her. But on the other hand, there's an obvious sadness in the fact that she can't share the idea of this strong bond between them with him because he's no longer around. The final image of the poem, though, is one of her living her life absolutely to the full. So ultimately, it's a poem that celebrates life and her father's memory. But if you're writing about tone in the exam, I think it's important to acknowledge that it does subtly shift throughout this poem. It's not simply a poem about grief and loss. It's much more complex and multi-layered than that. Anyway, let's go on to look at Walker's use of language in the poem. I'll move on to the second stanza now because we've already looked at the first one, the short one, in relation to the structure of the poem. You can see that obviously the free verse is maintained in this long stanza. It's the longest of the poem, and again you can see the heavy use of enjambment, suggesting again that Walker is searching for the words to capture these powerful memories that she's experiencing. The start of this stanza suggests that it's her action of writing some deposit slips and cheques that actually triggers the memory, because she associates money with her father. She remembers that he taught me how. He obviously instructed her on financial matters. This is the form, he must have said, the way it is done. Simple words and simple sentences reflecting the way that you would speak to a young child. So he taught and she learned, and what she learned was that financial security would give her a way out of the poverty which we infer that she lived in with her father. So I learned to see bits of paper as a way to escape. So those bits of paper are either hard cash, aren't they, or cheques, whichever, they represent freedom, a freedom from hard work and drudgery and the life that made her father so tired. And even in high school, she said she had a savings account. So money was not something that she took for granted as a child. Clearly, her father wanted to teach her some lifelong lessons about the importance of money, and he wanted her to have a better life than he had, better life than he knew, to quote from the poem. So he was a responsible father figure who had aspirations for his daughter. But it seems he was a hard man sometimes, a violent man even. He taught me that telling the truth did not always mean a beating. That word always is important. If it didn't always mean a beating, then clearly it sometimes did mean a beating. So honesty was important to Walker. Honesty and truth, that word truth is repeated in this stanza. Remember what I said in my introductory comments about this poem being written a year after The Colour Purple. Maybe here we have a reference to that because she says that many of my truths must have grieved him before the end. So Colour Purple was a book about male dominance and the oppression of women. And this would have been an uncomfortable truth if you were reading it as a authoritative black father figure with traditional values. So she uses the word grieved to describe how her father must have felt about some of the things that she said, some of the truths that she wanted to share with the world as a feminist and an activist. But this isn't a resentful poem, and the first line in this stanza underlines just how much Walker misses her father. How I miss my father. It repeats the first line of the poem, of course, but this time it's an exclamation suggesting the intensity of her feelings for him and the scale of the loss. And this stanza really celebrates his gifts. She describes him cooking good food, sharing of good food. So he's obviously a generous man. It made him happy to serve good food to people. And Walker uses an oxymoron to describe his movement when cooking. She says he was like a person dancing in a yoga meditation. Now that's an oxymoron because dancing we associate with movement, beautiful movement, and meditation with still contemplation. When her father's cooking, he appears to be doing both of those things. The oxymoron conveys a sense of just how complete her father was when he was doing, obviously, what he loved doing best, which was preparing voluptuous food for people. He was complete in that he moved beautifully, but there was also a focus about him because this was important work. He craved the sharing of food. This creates a sense of his generosity and Walker's father as a giving man, perhaps the preparing of food, ultimately an expression of love. In this stanza, the penultimate one, Walker celebrates the fact that she is now like her father. I look and cook just like him. The assonance there, look and cook, drawing our attention to their similarities. Like him, she's generous, happy to feed whoever strays my way. She's an instinctive cook. Her brain's light when she's cooking, so she's not thinking about it too much. And she is also tossing this and that into the pot. There's something very joyous and carefree about that image. And she seems to use it as a metaphor for her life, because after the semicolon we have seasoning none of my life the same way twice. This suggests that her father's been successful. He wanted her to lead a different life to his, and we do get the sense that she's not bogged down in drudgery. Her brain is light. She's tossing things into the pot of her life. None of it is seasoned the same way twice, so it's varied, different, not mundane, but rich and joyous. So her father would have been happy, and that is confirmed in the final stanza of the poem, which we'll look at now. Here she's confident that he would have grown to not just like her, but admire the woman I've become. And then in the final two lines of the poem, she's conveying a sense of just how full and rich her life is. Cooking, writing, chopping wood, staring into the fire. So that listing of facets of her life there, emphasising its fullness. She's obviously a practical, competent woman. We've already heard about cooking. She chops wood as well. But she also lives a rich intellectual life. So we have writing and a spiritual, meditative one as well, staring into the fire, implies that. So at age 39, referring to the title of the poem, Alice Walker seems to be able to reflect on her life and feel satisfied that it's a good life, and she acknowledges that her father and the way that he taught her has to be thanked for that in large part. You do get the sense, though, that she's sorry that she can't share this understanding and this gratitude with him, because he would have grown to admire the woman I've become. Suggests that when he died, they hadn't reached that point in their relationship. There wasn't that understanding or that mutual respect. There were instead those truths that grieved him. Some of Walker's feminism is evident in those final lines where she celebrates her independence. She does everything for herself, and there's also a reference to her activism in this idea of feeding anybody who comes her way. Any stray suggests a sort of sense of social responsibility, perhaps. But fundamentally, this is a personal poem, one that very honestly attempts to convey the complicated feelings that we all have for our parents to some extent. Clearly, she loved her father. She tells us twice in the poem that she misses him, and there's a strong sense of regret that she can't share with him her new understanding, which is that they were in fact more alike than they were different. I think a common feeling for everybody who's lost a loved one is that feeling of if only. In Walker's case, it's if only he could have seen the woman I am now at age 39, we would have got on so well. But in a sense, he's still around because he's living through his daughter. That's part of the message of the poem. And self-evidently, he's living through her writing as well, because here's a poem about him. So it's not just a poem about loss, this at all. It's not just about grief. It also celebrates the life that her father lived and acknowledges many of his strengths, as well as his failings as a man of his time, really. I don't think Walker judges him for the way he behaved. She sees him in his context, and clearly she's writing in a very different one. Not all poetry written in the first person has to be autobiographical, of course. Poets can put themselves into the shoes of absolutely anybody, but we can be confident that in this case, the poem is autobiographical. Alice Walker is exploring her memory of her father through this poem, and for that reason, it feels a very intimate, personal piece of writing. The voice we hear is Alice Walker's.